Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to Rare Variants. This is the series in which I talk about some of our favorite video game consoles throughout history, but an oddball version of them that might be some special edition, it might be a release that only came out in one country, or it's, who knows, some sort of prototype or whatever. I've got tons of videos like this on a playlist. You should check them out. And today we'll be specifically focusing on a very strange version of the Sega Mega Drive, aka the Sega Genesis, called the Mega Jet. We're going to talk about its history, we're going to talk about what it eventually led to, and of course we'll talk about, I guess, my experience with it. Before we do that, though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, my Spreadshirt travel channel. I appreciate the support on all those platforms. Thank you so much for watching. Let's get into it. Now, I'm sure a lot of you out there are very familiar with the Sega Genesis, aka the Sega Mega Drive, as it was known in Japan as well as Europe, and frankly most of the world outside of North America. And it's a very successful system for the most part, and a lot of us, I think, know that there was a lot of strange iterations and variations on that system. Now, that came from a multitude of different reasons, and I've talked about it a bit in the past, and it's very logical to assume that the reason a lot of these strange, absurd versions came about because of how successful the system was. But what if I told you in some cases it was actually born because of how not successful the system was? Enter the Sega Mega Jet. So here's the thing. While we obviously in North America, here in the US and Canada, associate the Genesis with being this big successful system, Sega's easily the most successful one they ever had. And I would argue that the same basic case can be made for Europe and potentially Australia, though I'm not totally sure about that one. I will tell you straight up that the system was actually a flop in Japan, in the home country that released it and birthed it and gave all the games, etc. Well, most of the games, as well as, Sega themselves, who is a Japanese corporation where pride is a very significant thing. When the Mega Drive released there in 1988, it actually wasn't successful. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but what we can truncate that by saying it actually was a pretty late machine for them. People forget that in Japan, they had multiple systems. They had the Sega SG-1000, they had the Sega SC-3000, which was a home PC. They had the Sega SG-1002, they had the Sega Mark III, they had the Sega Master System. By the time they got around to the Sega Mega Drive, Sega was they had this bad habit of basically being like, it's not working, let's drop the hardware. Unfortunately, they would continue to do that down the road. But in the case of the Genesis/Mega Drive, it was such a big hit in North America and Europe, Sega of Japan had no choice but to continue to support it, even though the Japanese did not embrace it. Now, that's a key point to understand because it would actually influence a lot of their decisions, including things like the Sega CD, which was actually born of the Japanese desire to try and entice the Japanese population to buy the Mega Drive, saying, okay, maybe you don't like the system itself or its games or whatever the issue is, we're not really sure, but what if we do this like CD attachment, because CDs are a brand new thing, it's new tech, better audio and all that, we'll build, karaoke functionality essentially into it, buy it for that reason. And then of course they had karaoke add-ons and all this other stuff, none of which really worked. But that logic was the crucible that forged the Mega Jet. So as early as 1993, Sega started developing this. Now, I don't know exactly what motivated this. I have heard a story, but this is pure conjecture. I'll say this up outright. I don't know if the story is actually true, but I'll tell it anyway. So what I've heard is that someone at Sega was taking a flight somewhere, and there were either kids who were being kind of annoying, and they clearly didn't have anything to do, and then there were other kids that were well-behaved, but they were basically playing like Game Boys, Nintendo's Game Boy, and the guy at Sega basically thought like, man, this is like really an untapped market, or at least a market we should be present in. But Sega's, the Game Gear really just didn't live up to that. And so the thought was, what if we kind of kill two birds with one stone here? What if we get into this market using the Mega Drive? Because at that point, it was 5 years old, so the technology costs had come way down. What if we get into that and we use this as a way to further entice the Japanese? The logic being that, hey, if Japanese kids enjoy this, maybe they'll bug their parents to buy them one. And then if the parents saw that, oh, Sega really made my family trip so much better, then maybe they themselves want to buy it for their kids because it makes their kids more well behaved. That's the story anyway. But what we do know actually happened is that in 1994, Sega cut a deal with Japan Airlines, also known as JAL, to produce this thing called the Mega Jet, hence the name Mega Jet. And the idea was they were going to make a portable version of the Mega Drive, aka Sega Genesis, specifically for aircraft. And the whole idea was that while you were on the plane, a kid could borrow this from the flight attendants. They would have a few of them on board, and it would have this proprietary power supply and proprietary video output that would connect to the monitor. Usually this would be designed for long hauls, not a short hop from, say, like Tokyo to Osaka, but, you know, Tokyo to San Francisco, for example. And so the idea was that kids could borrow this, and they would have a few select games on the flight. Possibly this is where the birth of things like the Sega Genesis 6-pack cartridge came from, though that's, again, pure conjecture, because they no doubt realized it was better to have multiple games on a single cartridge for this purpose. But either way, they would have a few different games. The only one I know for sure they actually had was Super Monaco GP. I'm pretty sure. Well, I guess I should say I'm pretty sure that was one of them, and likely a Sonic game or two. Were available as options for kids to play. So they would just borrow them on the flight, and that one actually was labeled specifically with a Japan Airlines sticker. Now, this promotion, if you want to call it that, even though that's where the whole thing came from, was not actually particularly successful. I don't think JAL even ran with them for a full year, to my understanding. But again, I did not ever witness this because I did not visit Japan as a child. But either way, what Sega ultimately did with it is they decided they put all this effort into R&D and, you know, designing it and building it, and they essentially wanted to sell off more units of it. So they ultimately did this. This is the retail edition of the system. This came out in Japan very briefly in 1994 and retailed for the equivalency of about $140 US at the time, which today is about $275 US. However, they did not support it particularly long, and they only made about 10,000 of these. There is actually a third version of this known as the Alpine Edition. You'll notice that on that version, this, once again, the sticker is different. Instead of saying Japan Airlines or saying Mega Drive as this one does, the Alpine version was this. Again, this is, I only know bits and pieces of this story, but Alpine is a sound engineering company in Japan, or at least they were. I don't even know if they're still around, but they basically made like sound equipment, and supposedly they had cut some deal with a car company. So I don't know which one it was. So let's just say it's like, you know, Mitsubishi or something. I honestly don't know which. And there was a certain model of a car that if you bought it with their sound equipment, you either were given a Mega Jet Alpine version as a bonus, or you had the option to buy it. And supposedly only like 500 of those were produced. But technically they made 3 iterations of this machine. But yeah, they didn't support it very long. It didn't last, and they ultimately moved on, as Sega has a tendency to do. 1994, the year in which this was released, was easily the most insane year in Sega hardware. Not only did they release this, that's the same year the 32X came out, the same year the Saturn came out, the same year the Sega Pico came out. It is multiple versions of Sega hardware. Like, we've got the Model 1 and Model 2 are here. Some of these models for the first time started coming to other countries. The CDX came out that year. The JVC XI came out that year. 1994 was completely insane. So it's not that shocking they didn't support this thing for very long. And then ultimately, that was kind of all she wrote. It was not a success in Japan, but Sega would actually take some concepts from this and say, like, okay, you know what? A portable Genesis / Mega Drive wasn't a bad idea. It was just our mentality of using it as a way to entice the Japanese probably wasn't a good approach. But there is one place where the system is successful, North America. Why don't we redesign it for that? So they took this concept, they slightly modernized it, and they created what was called the Sega Venus, an unreleased prototype that Sega only told us about in 2020, actually. I'll put a photo up of it, and they slightly retooled that, and eventually that gave birth to the Sega Nomad, which we've got right here, that would release in late 1995 in North America only. So only the US and Canada actually got this, but this only came about because the Mega Jet had been created. And, you know, it's a very strange idea when you look at it. You're like, so it's a portable version of the Sega Genesis that has no screen. Very bizarre. And even more bizarre is it doesn't have batteries. So what you do have on it, so we'll talk about the retail version, because that's obviously what I have, the more common of the three. And it's not common, by the way. Like, I have been to Japan 20 times. 20. Yes, really, that many times. In all that time, I've only ever seen this twice over there. One was in a store that wanted an exorbitant amount of money for it, and the other was Sega themselves. In 2018, Sega brought me out to Sega Fest. I think it's one of the sticker press passes thing right back there. And they had this like history of the Mega Drive, and that was the only other time I had seen one of these. It is a very uncommon system. Now on it, it has, like I said, when they released it at retail, they changed up the power supply and the video output. The power supply is actually the exact same as a Model 2 Genesis or Mega Drive, and the same one as the 32X, etc. It also has a standard, I believe it's the 9-DIN pin out that is on the back of the Model 2 Genesis or 32X. So it supports RF, composite, and RGB actually. It has on the front of it a power LED that turns green when on. It has a reset and start button, just like you would expect here on the body of the system. Well, the reset button, the start button, obviously would be on the controller. It has the 6 face buttons instead of the 3, which was smart for them because there were more games taking advantage of that, and I'm assuming Street Fighter played a role in that decision. It has the D-pad, very similar, obviously, to a standard Sega Genesis one. On the bottom, it has a headphone jack and headphone dial, which makes perfect sense for adjusting the volume. It also has a second controller port, so if somebody wants to play along with you, they can. On the side, it has a power switch that's just a simple on-off toggle, and on the other side, it has a mode button for the handful of contexts in which you would ever need that. Interestingly, the cartridge slot, which is designed, as you can see, I've got a Japanese Mega Drive game there. It's designed for those. However, it is big enough due to the shape where actually North American Genesis games will fit in here, as will European. I'm not going to say that the European games will always work, but a good chunk of the American games will. The Genesis had kind of odd region coding. Initially, it was essentially region free, and all that defined the region parameters was the physical shape of the cartridge slot. And in the case of the Japanese systems, there's a little plastic bar that kind of cuts into the cartridge, and on the Japanese carts there was like a physical little space to like lock the cart in place. Since the American games didn't have that, it would not physically turn on with that in there. But this doesn't have that parameter, thus there's nothing physically preventing it from activating. So eventually Sega realized that import policy was a little strange, and they decided to do it software based. What I guess I'm basically saying is like half of the North American Genesis library is actually region free from a technical perspective, and about half of it isn't. So some games will work, some will not. Is really where I'm going with that. Yeah, but like I said, it doesn't even support batteries, which I found to be kind of strange. So basically, it's a portable Genesis that really isn't that portable. It does require you to be near a television. And the reason I bring that up is, again, we obviously talked about the Nomad, which itself has a screen, so it obviously needed to have battery support. But if you compare it to something bizarre, like this is the same basic idea that Sega also released in 1994, the Super Master System Super Compact that only came out in Brazil. It's the exact same notion as the Mega Jet. It's a wireless, or sorry, not wireless. Well, actually, the Master System is. It's a portable version of that system that has no screen, except in the case of the Super Compact, it actually has a battery slot in the back, so you could power it with batteries or a power supply. But of course, it's also a bigger machine. Whereas the case of the Mega Jet, no doubt they wanted to save on space and the technology of it, so they just relied on a power supply. Strange choice, but it is ultimately what they did. I think the box art obviously looks very nice. It's very cool to see. Also, look at that. You're not going to see this very often. Look, these 3 systems all together, 3 different portable Sega pieces of hardware, and none of them are the Game Gear. I think that's pretty cool. So how did I end up with one of these? Oh, you must have found it in a trip to Japan. No, actually. So in what happened with me is I always kind of thought the Mega Jet was going to be a system I never really ended up having. But one day I was very surprised. In my Discord, which I mentioned before, and you should totally join if you want to talk about random pieces of video game hardware and stuff like that. There was a guy in there named Blue Fates, who's a very nice Canadian man who lived up in like Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. So like a pretty remote part of Canada. He messages me one day. He's like, "Hey, Adam, this is kind of weird. My local game store has a boxed complete Mega Jet." And I was like, huh. He showed me a photo, and you could see like they had price tags on it at the time, and they kept slashing it because it clearly had just been sitting there for years, and in CAD. So when I actually did the conversion on it, I was like, that's actually pretty reasonable for that system. And I was like, are you willing to send that? He's like, yeah. He's like, if you're willing to pay for it, obviously I'll buy it and I'll just send it to you. So he actually paid for the shipping, which thank you, Blue Fates, again for doing that. So that was how we did that. And once I got it, I was like, wow, because it's in unbelievable shape. It's very clean. Mine looks really, really good. It almost comes off like whoever had been the previous owner hadn't really played it much, but there's an odd PS to that story. So once I got it, I decided, all right, let me, I'll kind of dust it off. Not that I really needed much of that, and I'll try it out. I immediately got it to work. It didn't have any issues as far as actually powering up and starting a game, but the video output on this thing, it came with a set of composite cables, and it looked horrific, like absolutely horrific. Like I think it was in black and white, and it was all staticky. I was like, oh, I think maybe it's got some dead caps in it or something. I didn't really know. Now, as I said, the system supports RGB, so I decided to connect it up that way. And then the color came back, but it still looked really bad, like super fuzzy and everything. And I was like, I think it needs new caps. So I took it to a buddy of mine in Indiana. His name is Chris. I'll put a link in the description to him if you need stuff repaired. He's very good at that type of thing. So I brought it to him, and I was like, I'm pretty sure it just has a bunch of dead caps. See what you can do. He's like, all right. So he opens it up, and he's like, yeah, there were some dead caps, but he's like, I did fix those, and that helped, but that actually wasn't the issue. And I was like, well, what was the issue? He's like, so I opened it up, and inside near the video chip, someone had kind of like haphazardly soldered on an additional chip that really shouldn't have been there. And he's like, I don't really know why. He's like, but it looks like what it was doing was converting NTSC to PAL. And I was like, wow, like that didn't make any sense to me. And then I thought about it. Inside this box, the power supply came with it. There's actually two power supplies in there. One is the North American / Japanese style. Someone else, though, had apparently thrown in a mainland European style with that like 2 prongs they use. Not the same type as the UK, which uses a 3 prong. So somebody in mainland Europe, this is what we did do. Someone in mainland Europe at some point owned this machine and decided, I want to use it on a PAL television. Oh, it outputs NTSC. I got to fix that. So they put on some sort of conversion chip that just made the video quality terrible. And then they eventually brought it to Canada and sold it there. So this thing has had quite the journey, born in Japan, acquired there, brought to mainland Europe at some point, presumably, I'm guessing maybe like Germany, but I guess I don't really know that. I'm pretty sure it's not France just because they wouldn't have put a C-cam adapter on it, but I guess I don't really know that. Definitely not the UK or Ireland, though. Anyway, so then they brought it out to a relatively rural part of Canada with its box for some reason, and then sold it there, and then it sat there for years before eventually making its way down to the United States and had the PAL modification removed. And what's odd to me is that someone would put all that effort into it, and yet the system itself looks like it's almost never been used. Very bizarre to me. But yeah, that is my story with the Mega Jet, and basically the story of the Mega Jet in general. Now, I'm curious, does anybody out there actually have one? If you do you ever really use it? Because I'll tell you right now, it's a terrible way to actually play the Genesis. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to do that, given how many better options for the system actually exist, even if you're not including modern solutions. It's just kind of a dumb way to do it. It's purely a collectible, but the reason I wanted it is so bad was that it's just a very unique piece of Sega hardware, especially because, again, 1994, that magic year where Sega was just releasing everything they possibly could. Again, both of these came out in 1994, and there's a good chance none of you have ever really heard of it. Like, that should tell you a lot. Granted, the Nomad was 95, but yeah, I'm just saying, and that's on top of also having, the CDX, the JVC XI, the Sega Pico, the Sega 32X, the Sega Saturn, all of that stuff launched in the same year. Just absolutely bonkers. If you do want one of these, they do show up on eBay. They're extraordinarily expensive. For some reason, a bunch of these have made their way to China, and there's Chinese websites that are selling these, but they're always in really bad condition. Frankly, I just really lucked out, and thanks to Blue Fates for making that possible. But yeah, if you want one, it's really, honestly, guys, it's purely for the purposes of just collecting. But all the same, there are those 3 iterations. I do know that some people have managed to track down that Alpine version, because technically that was released to the public, just in a very strange context. It also has a slightly different box. I think Sonic is actually featured on the cover of that box. I've never known anybody to have the Japan Airlines one, though. That would be the rarest one, no doubt, because you were never supposed to be able to own it. It also would be the most useless, as it required a specific power and video connection only built into the back of the aircraft they were using at the time. So yeah, good luck with that one. But if you do want it, there's dumber things out there to get. I'll say that. So there you go. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. And if you're interested, like I said, I've got a bunch of different videos on random pieces of hardware like this. At some point, I'll also do a video on the Super Compact as well. I think this is a system that does not get anywhere near as much attention as it should. And I have done a video on the history of the Nomad if you want to check that out as well. So with that in mind, to stay tuned to more videos, as of course, if you could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, and check out all my social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, my Patreon. I really appreciate the support over there. Spreadshirt, Travel Channel. I appreciate the support on all those platforms. You can always stay tuned to more content from me, whether it's video game stuff or other stuff, and just finding out everything else that I'm doing that you might actually enjoy. I appreciate the support. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.